Simon, and welcome to my crib. Oh, I'm dizzy. So today we are continuing our discussion of evolution. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So lesson 4.3, mechanisms of evolution. So today's lesson outcome is that students should be able to describe and analyze scenarios about the various mechanisms of evolution. You should also continue to be able to explain adaptation, fitness, natural selection, and also be able to describe and understand scenarios of each. Okay, so natural selection was the last lesson 4.2. So in natural selection lesson, we learned that this is a central theme in evolution, right? Because it explains how organisms adapt to their environments and also how variations, by chance, some organisms have good variations and some have bad variations, okay? And that can actually give rise to various adaptations within species. However, natural selection is not the only way that evolution occurs. It's not the only way that evolution occurs. Okay, so just continuing our discussion of our recap of last lesson, selective advantage. So to have selective advantage means that an organism is born with a variation. So in this example right here, we see that there's some giraffes are born short, some are born medium, and some are born very tall. Just by chance in their DNA allows them to be born that way. Okay, so some of them are going to have an advantage. In this example, this tall giraffe is able to reach the tops of trees, which means that is an advantage. It's able to eat more. Okay. The other ones are more likely to die off, and if they die off, they're not reproducing. If they're not reproducing, then their gene frequency is decreasing. Their genes are disappearing from the population, while this one that is able to survive and reproduce is increasing its place in the population. Okay. So again, natural selection, the process of it. Each species is going to show some sort of variation. So again, we have tall giraffes and we have short ones. Okay, of course, there's going to be competition because resources are limited. Okay, since there's competition, some organisms are going to be able to be better adapted and they're able to survive. That is known as survival of the fittest. Okay, while those survivors are going to pass on their better genes to their offsprings. If they're passing on their genes to their offsprings, and their offspring are probably going to be tall or whatever that adaptation is in that example. Okay, so they're going to show that beneficial variation. Okay. Okay, one thing to note, this is very important, is that evolution occurs in populations over time, over millions of years. Okay, not in individuals. Not in individuals. An individual bird cannot decide, oh, I'm about to evolve. No, you have to be born with a certain type of variation. That certain type of variation allows you to survive. If you can survive, then you can reproduce, and then your species is going to evolve over time. No one organism is evolving, right? Organisms are not evolving. Okay. Again, evolution is that process of changing the gene frequencies over time. Okay. So evolution can be the result of many different environmental and genetic circumstances. Today, you're going to learn about some of these mechanisms of evolution. So what actually causes evolution to occur. Okay. The last lesson we talked about natural selection. Natural selection is a big part of what causes evolution to occur. But again, like I said, there are many circumstances that can cause evolution. So today we're going to learn about, I think, 5 or 6 of them. Okay. So again, this is straight from the Quizlet cards, which hopefully you guys are looking at them and having them open as you complete your virtual notebooks and things. Because like I said, they're very good cards and I work hard on them. So mechanisms of evolution are going to cause species to evolve, right? A mechanism is what causes something to happen. We already talked about natural selection. So today we're going to talk about these other ones. So mutation, recombination, gene flow, genetic drift, and the various types of isolation. Okay? And also keep in note, there are other mechanisms as well, but these right here are some of the more common ones. Okay, so let's talk about mutations. So mutation is going to be a change in the DNA sequence. Okay, as we know, DNA is passed from parent to child, from parent to offspring. So if the parent's DNA mutates, then that parent gives birth, then there's very likely that offspring is going to have that mutated DNA. Okay, so again, this is the original sequence of some strand of DNA, and there's a mutation where that place where there was a T in the DNA is now a C. That's a mutation, a change in the DNA sequence. Okay, So let's look at this example right here. So we see two birds eating in the same place. Okay, there's some bugs inside of this tree. The original bird has DNA that has a beak like this, while this mutated bird DNA causes the beak to be shaped like that. Notice that the original DNA is not able to reach the food here, so it has to go and find food elsewhere. But this mutated DNA is adapted. It can have food here. Okay? So just keep in mind, many mutations are going to cause harm or even death, but a few actually can help the organism survive and reproduce more. Okay, so just don't always think that mutations are bad. Mutations can be good. They can help the organism survive and reproduce more depending on their environment. Okay, so mutation example right here. We start off with one organism. Okay, that mutation is going to create some sort of variation. Okay, so some of the organisms are going to mutate to be this light color, while some of the organisms are going to mutate to be this color. Are going to be, well, okay. When I'm saying mutate, I'm not talking about like gets bit by a spider and then starts shooting webs from themselves. I mean more so like their parent, as they're giving birth, like through the process of reproduction, there's a mutation in the DNA. Okay, and that way when that organism is born, it already has that DNA. Okay, that's what I'm talking about in this situation. Just want to clarify that. Okay, so unfavorable mutations are selected against just based off of the environmental conditions, which means that if that's selected against, they're dying off, they're not reproducing. These can still reproduce, and these will as well. Okay, there's reproduction and possibly even more mutations that are causing more and more variation. Because look, right at this point, we started off with only this color. Now we're starting to see some different colors, right? We're seeing some more variation in the genes. Okay, so then the favorable mutations are going to be more likely to survive. And if they're more likely to survive, they're likely going to be more likely to be able to reproduce. Okay, so that's what mutations can be good. They can help an organism to survive more. Let's go on to DNA recombination. So DNA recombination is going to be crossing over of what are called homologous paired chromosomes. Okay, so homologous paired chromosomes and DNA replication, all of that we will talk about later. So I'm just going to give you the basics of what you need to know. Okay, essentially, you're going to begin with this DNA. Okay, and we're going to end up with this DNA. This is through the process of fertilization. Okay, we can say this is the mom and that's the dad DNA. And in the end, we're going to end up with 4 different sex cells that have all of these different traits in them. Okay, so again, these are the homologous chromosomes. And this is what is known as a process of DNA combination. As you can see, we started with all blue and all reds. But through the process of DNA recombination, we end up with a blue that has a little bit of red and reds that end up with a little bit of blue, right? They crossed over and they exchanged genetic material. Okay, the product of this process is going to be these types of chromosomes that are all mixed. Okay, so if we start off with this and we end up with this, did the genetic variation decrease or did the genetic variation increase? It increased, right? Because like I said, right here, this is all solid. This is all one type of DNA. But in the end, we ended up with some that has a little bit of that blue DNA. So the variation, it was able to exchange. The variation has increased. Okay? So again, like I said, that's kind of a brief overview of that. We will talk about DNA and all of that in great depth, but that's later on. So this is just kind of the basic overview. Okay? So like mutation, this is what you need to know. Like mutations, DNA recombination is an important source of new variation for natural selection to work upon. Okay, so this is another way. DNA can mutate, but DNA also can recombine. Okay, that's an important source of new variation. Let's go on to the next topic of gene flow. So gene flow is the exchange of genes between 2 separate populations. So we have a population over here, we have a population over here. These have one set of DNA and these have a different set of DNA. Now, if a beetle leaves this population and comes over here, it has just migrated, right? Its genes are coming with it. It's coming over here and it's bringing up brown beetle DNA. If it mates with any of these right here, then their genes are going to intermix, okay? So it's going to cause, that's what's called gene flow. So again, an individual is going to migrate. They're going to breed inside of their new population. That causes the DNA to mix. That is when gene flow occurs. And gene flow causes evolution. It's a mechanism of evolution. Okay? So the random movement of organisms between populations blanks genetic variation. Does it increase or decrease genetic variation? It's going to increase genetic variation, right? Like I said, before this population was all green beetles with all very, very similar types of DNA. Now we brought in a beetle that is brown. That's a different color. It means it has a different DNA, which means that once they mix together, they're going to increase genetic variation, increase the differences. Okay? Genetic drift. Genetic drift is going to be the change in a gene frequency just by a random chance. Just by random chance. This usually occurs in very small populations. So we have two types, bottleneck and founder's effect. So the bottleneck effect, again, is a type of genetic drift. It's an event that drastically reduces the size of a population. This is what it could look like. So we have an original population. Out of this population, who would you say is the most dominant color? Okay. Now there's a bottlenecking event, which just means that most of the population is killed off and there are a few survivors. Okay, they're called the surviving population. There's a very few survivors. These survivors are going to mate and reproduce. So the new population ends up looking like this. Okay, so compare the new to the original population. Compare those two populations. Exactly. It can totally change. Through a bottlenecking event, populations can drastically change. Okay, let's talk about founder's effect. This is kind of what it sounds like, right? You know what a founder is? A founding father, a founder of a company is someone who left their original and started their own. Okay, they're going to leave their original population and begin their own colonies. So here's an example right here. We start off with this original population of ladybugs. Okay, some are red and some are green. By chance, 4 of these red ones are going to leave that original population and create their own population. So something to note. Newly founded populations don't always represent the genetic diversity in their sources. So founder's effect. Founder's effect, okay, is when a few of them leave their population to go and create their own new population. Okay, now let's talk about the different types of isolation. Isolation. So luckily basically like their names kind of tell you what they are. So geographic isolation, we know that geography, we're talking about where things are on a map, right, where they are in space. So we have an original population of snails, and then by chance, some of them are going to migrate this way and some of them are going to migrate that way because of this giant hole right here. Over time, they'll reproduce with each other and they're going to start their own species, right? Geographic isolation just means that they'll be in different areas and they'll begin to look different from one another. Okay? Behavioral isolation is just the behaviors of organisms. How do they behave? So, for example, the main example of this is going to be mating behaviors. So, birds have different calls, right? And their different calls kind of tell signal to other mates that can hear it. Oh, I'm ready to mate, right? So if this bird is singing this song, this bird doesn't enjoy their mating behaviors. They're not going to mate. Okay, so behavioral isolation is a difference in mating behaviors. This can lead to speciation. Okay, there are many examples of behavioral isolation, including even like the timing of mating. So there are certain organisms that mate in July. There are other organisms that mate in October, right? So if this organism wants to mate in July and this one's in October, then they have behavioral isolation. Their mating behaviors are different. They're never going to mate together. Okay, so again, here are some more examples of this. Okay, reproductive isolation happens when there are two individuals that can no longer mate with each other and produce viable offspring. So for example, this frog is over here and this one's over here. This frog is like, I'm ready to mate. And this one's like, no, our mating sites are different. Okay, so reproductive isolation refers to the inability of a related species to breed. So there's an original population, and over time, due to, whatever, whether reproductive, basically any of the mechanisms of evolution occur. Okay, so over time, we're starting to see some difference, starting to see like a blue population pull up. Then there's like a very, kind of, you can see clearly where the difference is. And eventually, they're going to lead into two totally different species once they're completely reproductively isolated. Okay, that's reproductive isolation is going to lead to speciation. Speciation, species, is just creating a new species. Okay, reproductive isolation. This happens, notice this arrow right here, it happens over time. So we start off with one population, we begin to see some differences, we begin to see some very clear differences, and then once they can no longer mate with each other, they're said to be different species. Okay, so let's practice some together. So, what mechanism of evolution is being shown here? Mutation. We know that it's mutation because we see that this DNA sequence was mutated. What mechanism of evolution is being shown in this example? Founder's effect, right? We have an ancestral population and then we have a new colony. What mechanism of evolution is being shown in this example? It's going to be disruptive natural selection. Exactly. Because, so we have a normal population, a normal curve population, the Gaussian curve, right, in which we see there are light organisms, there's a normal mid-ranged organism, and then there's the other extreme, the darker ones. Okay, and this is a disruptive selection in which this middle population is drastically reduced because these other ones are being more favored. Okay, what mechanism of evolution is being shown in this example? Notice the different notes. Okay, this is behavioral isolation because there's a difference in the mating behaviors, the mating calls. Behavioral isolation. Okay, so this map right here is showing the range of cheetahs in Africa. It is believed that cheetahs had a much larger population until a bottleneck event occurred. What effect would you assume the bottleneck had on the reproductive rate of cheetahs? Exactly. So the bottleneck effect is going to cause the reproductive rate to decline. The species appears to be extremely inbred, which leads to more birth defects and less survival. Okay? Also, human activity. Humans are all up and through here, right? Which limited their ability to expand their population back to their normal limits. Okay, suppose some members of a tree frog population begin mating a month earlier than the other members of the same population. What type of isolation will occur? Reproductive isolation. They're mating at a totally different time. That's a reproductive isolation. You also could have said behavioral isolation because they have different mating behaviors, the different timing of it. But just know that behavioral and geographic isolation lead to reproductive. It's a little bit, yeah. Okay. I think this is the last problem right here. So when a bat migrates to another part of the canyon 40 miles away and reproduces with that bat population in the new location, gene flow occurs. As this bat contributes to the gene pool of this new population, which of these is increasing? Genetic variation is increasing. So, if you weren't sure about that problem, here's what I like to do. I always like to break down, when I'm going through problems, I like to break down each word, just make sure that I know what they are. So succession is the rebuilding of an ecosystem after a disaster. This has nothing to do with like disasters or rebuilding, none of that. Fitness is the ability to survive and reproduce in an environment. It didn't talk anything about them being able to survive and reproduce. It just said they did mate, but it didn't talk about, oh, it has to survive. No, it didn't say anything about that. Natural selection is going to be organisms with beneficial traits are going to be selected for an increase in the population, while others are going to be selected against and they're going to die off in the population. Did it say anything about that? No, not at all. Okay, so genetic variation is going to be the differences in the DNA and traits of organisms. We're saying gene flow occurs. We know that gene flow increases genetic variation because it's introducing new DNA into an already existing population, right? So it's introducing new DNA, new and different DNA, then boom, that's genetic variation. Okay, so your next steps are going to be to complete your exit ticket and work on the section that is titled Mechanisms of Evolution in the virtual notebook. Okay, that's all I got for you. Get into it.